Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring how our brains can use stereotypes to draw the wrong conclusions. If I say the word American, you're more likely to think of a white person than anyone else. If I say the word doctor, you're more likely to think of a man. My guest, Kirsten Morehouse, is a PhD candidate in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, with a secondary field in data science. She's also the co-president of Harvard's Women in Psychology. Kirsten uses behavioral and computational methods to study humans' attitudes and beliefs about social groups, especially beliefs that conflict with consciously held values or ground truth data. Kirsten came across my radar because she's been doing some fascinating research with Professor Mahazarin Banerjee on something you might be familiar with. It's a famous riddle that relies on a stereotype based on misjudgment to cause confusion. I'll let Kirsten explain that to you on the show. The reason I'm interested in this subject is that while stereotypes, like other forms of bias, can serve a useful purpose, or at least did for our ancestors, they can also drive very poor decision-making in the 21st century. If we want to mitigate human risk and get the best out of people, we need to recognise where inaccurate stereotypes are clouding human judgment. Before we begin, a reminder that my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out in March and available for pre-order right now. You'll find links in the show notes. If you pre-order ahead of the release date in March, from whichever bookstore you prefer, just make sure you keep your receipt. You'll get access to exclusive content and events, details of which will follow in the new year. With that said, let's get on with the show. What you're about to hear is one of those episodes which gave me real pause for thought, and I hope it does the same for you, because what I'm about to explore with Kirsten are stereotypes that drive all of our thinking in ways we might not always be aware of. So please enjoy my conversation with Kirsten Morehouse on stereotypes. Kirsten, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'm thrilled to have you here, and we're going to be talking about something really interesting. But before we do that, can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and your area of research?
Sure. So my name is Kirsten Morehouse, and I'm a graduate student at Harvard University working with Dr. Mahazarin Banerjee. Broadly speaking, I study implicit attitudes and stereotypes towards social groups. For example, the stereotype that connects surgery more with men than women, and the stereotype that American is implicitly synonymous with white. So when I say implicit, I mean associations that are more automatic and less controllable. And unlike explicit association, these which can be accessed via self-report, we index these implicit associations by using reaction time measures and more recently, natural language processing.
So just unpick. I'm going to dumb this down for my own benefit. So basically, you're saying there are certain words, and that might be an occupation, that might be nationality, that when we use those, there is an association that people will typically have. And so the example you've just given is if we say the word surgeon, people will admit, oh, that must be a man, and therefore an American, oh, that must be a white person. And of course, that is not correct. A very obvious point there, but because of that stereotypical perception that we have, that leads us to draw all sorts of conclusions. So it's a really good illustration of, I guess, the concept of unconscious bias, right? That's where our brains go to when we're looking to interpret something quickly. We know that our brains like to jump to conclusions, and so what you're doing is saying, well, let's examine this, right? Because this causes all kinds of problems.
Yeah, exactly. And you can think about humans, we love to learn. And as we're going through our environments, we're noticing that there are certain patterns in the world. And sometimes this can come in the form of certain groups tend to have certain roles. So, for example, you might think historically there were more men that were doctors than women. And even though this is changing over time, we still see that this residual association that men are more likely to be doctors, are more likely to be surgeons, persists. And this shapes the things like what we think are the sorts of traits that are really important to be surgeons. And so what happens is that you start thinking that things like being competitive or being masculine, all of these sort of traits are now becoming important to be a successful surgeon. And this creates these more deeply rooted essentialist beliefs about who can be a surgeon. And so, even as representation change, as the distribution of people in different roles change, you still see some of these stereotypes because we have all of these beliefs that start happening because we're seeing these patterns in the world.
And so implicitly, I'm guessing this is always true, but correct me if it's not. Once upon a time, the presumption that would have got us to saying, a surgeon or a doctor, "Oh, I think of a man," was there was a basis to that on because society was structured in that way. So, in other words, our ancestors who were using that shortcut, for want of a better phrase, were doing so for valid reasons in the sense of that is how society did operate. And so we have just taken over this presumption in what we're doing today. Is that the right way to look at it?
Yeah, I think that's what the observational learning perspectives would posit. Basically, that some parts of our stereotypes are actually based on things we're observing in the world. And what becomes super problematic about these stereotypes is when they don't change and when we apply them when we shouldn't. So, for example, if we now all of a sudden have trouble imagining a female surgeon, even when we're coming in contact one, or when you're in a room where the surgeon likely is, and you see a woman and you ask, "Oh, can you tell me where the surgeon is? Or when is the surgeon going to be coming back?" These sorts of situations, when you're faced with information that should otherwise tell you that this person is of that role. But because we have these stereotypes that say, "Oh, no, surgeons are typically men," then we see a person in the room who otherwise looks like a surgeon and assume that they're the nurse or assume that they're a PA.
Right. And so it's not sort of facts that hit it. It's literally staring us in the face. And we are going to these presumptions, and that manifests itself in what we think, and therefore most obviously in what we say and how we react to people.
Yeah, and then perhaps one really striking example of this is, like I mentioned earlier, there's this stereotype that connects this idea of American more with white. And what you see is that even when you represent this concept of white with people who are famously British, and we represent other groups like Asian as people who, like Michelle Quad, are people who actually were in the Olympics. They were became famous because of their association with American. You still see on implicit measures that we have this tendency to ascribe this concept of American to someone who is European, but they're white, versus someone who is American but Asian. And so this is an example of where there is a clear factual dichotomy. Someone is either American or they're not. And yet, because of these historical trends, either in who is actually American or beliefs about the certain qualities that it means to be a true American, like being patriotic or being Christian, these sort of things affect something that is actually factually incorrect.
And so, having grappled with this topic, and sort of, and when you point it out, we can all think of examples where we've done it, or we've seen other people do it. So this is not a hidden thing at all. And so the focus of your research is to look and explore this dynamic. And so you've recently published something, which is how I came across you, that I think is astonishing. And I'm going to let you tell the story because I want you to do it full justice. So can you talk about the research that you've been doing and the genesis of that?
Yeah. So there's this riddle, and we can't exactly trace exactly the first time it was used, but it became really popular when it aired in this episode, All in the Family, which was this American sitcom on CBS in the 70s. And this show, All in the Family, starred this working class American family, the Buckner family, and it tackled topics that weren't typically discussed on TV at the time. So things like racism, religion, and women's rights. And there was one episode that aired in 1972 called Glory and the Riddle. And in this riddle, one of the main characters poses this riddle to the rest of the family. Should I go ahead and share it?
Yeah, totally, totally, totally.
Okay. So the riddle goes like this. A father and his son are in a car accident. The father dies. The son is rushed to the ER. The attending surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I cannot operate on this boy. He is my son. How can this be?" So I know you now know the answer, but imagine this family sitting around in lots of, yellow and beige furniture that's patterned. And they provide these 6 or 7 possibilities, ranging from things like the surgeon must have been reincarnated, or it wasn't actually the child, to, some more reasonable answers like, oh, the surgeon must be the stepfather. Um, but as we all know now, the answer that never came up is the mother. And as soon as you say the surgeon is the mother, everyone is sort of hitting themselves and is completely dumbfounded because the fact that they're recognizing this hole in their possibility, like they recognize this hole in their possibility space immediately. Like, of course, the surgeon could be the woman. And yet they kind of engage in these mental gymnastics, trying to search for every possibility to the point where they say, oh, there must be reincarnation happening. It's pretty striking because, of course, women can be surgeons and we see surgeons all the time. And yet, even in some of my research, we show that people who actually have a a mother or a sister, any female family member that is a mother or a surgeon, we're still seeing that about 70% of those people are getting the mother response. So it's really, really pervasive stereotype.
I mean, this is. I remember, being asked this as I was growing up, and I'm not ashamed to admit, I couldn't work it out, and then it's point, and the sort of the big reveal, and then you're like, oh my god, that's quite embarrassing. But even nowadays, that is, and there was a BBC News article just I think a year ago. Well, who knows? COVID, right? Could have been 2 years ago, could have been 10 years ago. Either way, recently, right,
Yeah.
was where the same trick worked, I guess, and people still fell for it. So this is something that, I mean, you reference a TV show that's 50 years old,
Yeah.
and so that was a big thing then, and we would like to think that we'd made progress since then, and therefore that the shock value of that would have declined, that we would be able to work the trick out, and so it's a really, this is pretty visceral stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think that there is some hope. So we do see that younger participants, for example, are more likely to get the mother response. But I will push back a little bit about saying that this is a trick or there's a grand reveal. Like, remember, what we're revealing here is that there can be a female surgeon. And so I think it's a little bit, it's especially striking to think that that is what this grand reveal is. And also, we're not asking people to provide one solution or their best solution. They're sitting there on their computers with unlimited time, able to provide multiple solutions. And some people do. And some people say, everything from the priest to, oh, it's something with the syntax to, giving reasonable answers like there are two gay parents or this is a second father. But what's so remarkable is that we have coded things in such a way that as long as the mother solution comes up in any of the lists, we're giving them credit for that solution. We're totally okay. And we embrace the idea that there are multiple correct solutions. But what we think is so surprising is that the mother solution isn't coming up even amongst a list of, many, many solutions that people are racking their brains for. So I think that the term riddle is a little bit misleading here because it's not like, we're asking one of those classic riddles where the solution requires a lot of imagination. The solution just requires looking up into the world and recognizing that it's not just men who can perform surgery. And so it's sort of crazy.
Right, and so you, I mean, are there was when you chose this example, which is a sort of well-known one, were there other ones that you could have chosen? Did this stand out? I'm not saying that the sort of biases that underpin it are unusual, but is this a standout example, or are there lots of examples of these things?
Well, I will say that we did also the same riddle, except now we're asking people to imagine a male nurse. So it's the same sort of framework, but we see that the stereotype is just as robust. So in the US, only about 9% of registered nurse are men. And so when we ask this question, saying something like the attending nurse looks at the girl and says, I can't treat this girl. She is my daughter, then you see the same thing that people are racking their brains and trying to figure out who it is, and no one realizes that the nurse could be the father. So I don't know if this is like particularly remarkable in terms of showing that these stereotypes have such a strong hold on what we can imagine. But I will say that there have been people who have done many years ago when these riddles were just starting to get popular. We see other versions. About a pilot or a fireman. And we do tend to see that these occupational gender stereotypes are pretty robust.
And it's interesting when you mention the fireman, because you could sort of say, well, okay, that's not as effective because you've got the word man in there, but obviously the term doctor or surgeon or nurse that there isn't that nuance that's there. And so you've decided, well, what we're going to do is have a look and see how this, I guess the question you're answering really is this still, do people still react the same way nowadays as they did in the past? And so you're really just exploring, I guess. Is the question, have we made any progress? I mean, how would you frame the context of what you're looking at?
Yeah. So we had an inkling that there wasn't as much progress as we'd expect because, casually, as we're talking about gender stereotypes in the classroom, this sort of comes up. We also had a pilot study back in 2012 when we were just sort of curious if we're still finding this effect. And so we had an inkling that there would still be a stereotype. And so we really wanted to understand why. Why are we still seeing this effect? And that's why we have 7 experiments in this paper because we're trying to ask questions like, okay, if we see this effect, who is showing it? Are there demographic variations? And is it just that there are certain groups of people, like perhaps maybe men are the only people who are showing the stereotype? And that's not what we see. We see that men and women are actually expressing the stereotype to a similar degree. And so we said, okay, is this effect just because people think we're tricking them by using the word riddle, like trying to understand any possibility? And that wasn't it. And so then we wanted to understand, how can we move this around? How can we actually reduce this stereotype? And that's where this work with the gender neutral language came in. And so we were interested in, are small tweaks in linguistics, so just the gender that we're referring to in the riddle, can we actually push around by, for example, introducing a mention of the female gender? So that's where we have this daughter condition, because you might imagine that, oh, maybe it's harder to imagine a female surgeon because as you're going through the riddle, there are a bunch of men. You have the father, you have the son, and then once you have surgeon, you're just assuming that's a man. And so, we first thought, okay, if we introduce a daughter, we introduce the female gender, maybe that will actually activate this concept and allow people to recognize that, oh, there are multiple genders here. It reminds me, we shouldn't need reminding, but we tried that.
Right.
And then we also just wanted to see there's all this burgeoning work showing that gender neutral language can be really helpful in loosening the grip of stereotypes. And so we included this gender neutral language condition, and that's really where we saw the biggest reduction in stereotypes. So when we replace this word son and we replace male pronouns with gender neutral pronouns, you see that this bias and stereotype reduces by up to 50%. Um,
Wow.
so, yeah, this is really remarkable because using gender neutral language is such a cost effective solution, right? And so you can imagine if you were a general practitioner or something, you're sitting in the office and maybe you have to give a referral about a couple of surgeons, right? So rather than saying that this is doctor, female name, last name, you might imagine just using doctor, last name and removing the gender of it. And not already what you're doing there is just providing people with the qualifications of the individuals, and you're not introducing this biasing information about the gender of the surgeon. So there are these like really easy tweaks. And of course, this is not going to be the silver bullet, but it was just sort of showing us that, wow, yes, these stereotypes are really robust, but they're also quite malleable.
And that is, I mean, it's amazing because on the one hand, this is deep rooted, and so you've pointed to the sort of 50 years of progress of some kind, and yet what you pointed to is some very small tweaks. I was going to use the word nudge, but I don't think that's appropriate. But very small tweaks to how we start to refer to things, and it can have a huge impact. I mean, that's astonishing. I mean, 50% is not insubstantial, right? That's a really big effect. We what was your sort of hypothesis going in? Were you expecting it to have some effect, but not that great, or just no clarity as to whether there would be any?
Yeah, so we thought that the female gendered condition would actually be the one that was performing really strong. We thought for sure that if we put a female, you know, exemplar in front of them, that people would, and especially in such close proximity to the question about the surgeon, we thought for sure this would really reduce the stereotype. So we thought that the gender neutral might reduce a little bit because you're, reducing some of the activation of more male exemplars, but we certainly didn't think that it would be much more effective than the female gendered. But as we looked around the literature, we started seeing all of this work showing that removing masculine generics and replacing them with gender neutral language was really effective, because you can imagine that using the masculine generics or the male person category, so saying something like male scientist, that's making that category much more salient in people's minds. And so using gender neutral language might actually stop and make people think about what the gender is of that person. And then when you start thinking about gender, you start thinking about the different possibilities. And then you suddenly, stop in your tracks and realize that the way you've been thinking was because you're following these stereotypes. But once you start and consider what the gender could be, then all of a sudden you're realizing, oh, of course, it's so obvious. It's not a trick. We're asking the gender of this person.
And I find it amazing because as I was reading the research and sort of as you were talking now, I'm thinking, well, actually, this points towards the way society's set up. Words really do matter, and titles matter, and how we refer to things matter. And so you could almost see that subconsciously, a long time ago, as people were creating these terms, that actually there was some purpose to doing that. That we sort of, we are really referring, and that's carried through. And so these subtle, in a way, we look at it as it's a very simple thing to change, and why wouldn't we do that if it has that sort of impact? That's a very, very powerful thing. But clearly, that also points back to, well, whoever was coming up with this in the first place, I'll put it in very loose terms, kind of knew what they were doing, right? It's sort of, it works very powerfully. It really does imprint itself on our decision making. And so that the door you're opening here is huge, because it doesn't just apply to this particular context. We can suddenly start to see a whole host of other things, which I find it incredibly exciting. I mean, presumably you're sitting there going, wow, this is, the read across is potentially huge here.
Yeah, and I think this goes all the way back to like lots of work with languages that don't have gender, right? And looking at how they're representing different concepts versus languages that are gendered. So if you think about German or Italian, and there's actually the other flip side is if you use female gender terms sometimes because of all of these um, historical antecedents about women having less status in society or being attached to jobs that are lower status, you see that all of a sudden when we start trying to both use masculine generics and also female generics, you actually start seeing that some of the status of different occupations starts dropping. So that's another reason. So it's not just necessarily saying he and her, it's really just the idea like, do we even need to add these gender? Like, do we have to say policeman? Can we say police? All of these things. And exactly like you're saying, it's sort of remarkable that these small linguistic tweaks that have any impact that we see from work across the board with other languages and also with this more experimental work. And it's not just us that are showing this. There are plenty of other different domains where we're seeing this effect. And I think as we sort of move forward and think about, both interpersonal conversations and also, more structural things like when you're introducing someone, trying to always use if they have a professional degree, using that degree, because there's all this work showing that in conferences, for example, if you look at introductions of speakers, it tends to be that when we're introducing a man, almost 95% of the time we're saying Dr. X. But when it's the woman, we now say, oh, Kirsten Morehouse and things like that. And so it's just something where it's so small. But if you can imagine all of those repeated experiences where you're not hearing female names co-occurring with the word doctor, right? And then that makes you start thinking about all of the work just showing how representation is really important when you actually ask young children about the sort of jobs they want to do. If you ask people, whether they think that they're going to be successful, and you have all of this data sitting in front of you showing that people who are underrepresented and don't see themselves in certain roles are less likely to continue. And so, sure, maybe this co-occurrence between the word doctor and female first names isn't going to be everything, but I think it'll start just giving us subtle reminders here and there that, yeah, this is not something that's just, restricted to people of one gender.
But that point you made around introductions, I mean, once you start to look, as ever with these things, once you
Mhm.
start to look for it, it's everywhere, and it's sort of on TV news shows, and the tick, and it's not even just what people say; it's what they put up on the screen. It really is sort of baked into this. And I was reflecting the other day as I saw, I started to notice that there were lots of women who were using their doctor title much more than And I thought, why are they doing this? And it makes perfect sense when you talk about it in the way that you do, because you think, well, actually, it is really necessary to reinforce this because it gets dropped. And that isn't just about their, and I guess, with my sort of male perspective, I'd always come in and go, oh, well, that's just their, why are they showing off? Right. There are plenty of men out there, but there is a real purpose to this. And I
Mhm.
think it's very interesting that we have to recognize that this deficiency in our thinking, frankly, in our way that we structure things, exists still today. And so I think, to your point, this is really powerful stuff that we need to step back a bit and just think, this isn't just about a riddle. This is about much more. And what you're pointing us towards is a direction that on the one hand says, well, it's so baked in, right? It still is a big issue. On the other hand, here's a really simple solution. And it struck me that when we think about it, it's possibly as much, it's almost a habit that we have developed as a society for, possibly for very bad reasons, but we can sort of sit here and say, well, we can do something about this. And so what I found really refreshing was that you were highlighting something that should concern us, but equally you've given us a very, it's not a, as you say, it's not a silver bullet, but it's a hack to move in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think even thinking more broadly, it's not just in using professional titles, but also just about the words we're using, right? We know that there are so many traits that are really gendered. So someone being really caring or really brilliant, we know that when we're describing men in letters of recommendation, for example, we're much more likely to talk about their brilliance, all of these things. When we're talking about women, we are trying to be super, super positive, and we're saying they are so kind, they are so supportive, they are so smart. And, we feel like those things are really, really positive. But when you're hiring from someone for a job and you look at these two letters of recommendation and you see, oh, I have this person who is going to be a great team member, they're really supportive, or I have this person who is just absolutely brilliant. And we have this bias for brilliance even over hard workers. So this is a study that was in like 2005, and they were looking at people who either were really great musicians because they have been training every day since they were 5, or you had these amazing musicians who were amazing because they are just naturally brilliant. They have this innate talent. And when you show someone the same piece of music and you tell them it is either by the person who has this natural talent or who is incredibly hardworking, they say that the same piece of music is better if it's by the person who is just naturally brilliant. And we see this effect of brilliance also through different fields. And you see that fields where things like brilliance are really important, or quote important, to be really successful. So things like philosophy, where this idea that you have to just be absolutely brilliant in order to be successful, those are really highly correlated with the gender gaps in those fields. So fields that don't require brilliance as much, and being hardworking can also get you the same result. You see that that's where the gender distribution is either more equal or even on the side of female biased. So it's not just, talking about the titles we're using, but it's really just stopping to consider how we are talking about people differently depending on gender. So there are all of these things, and that has really strong impacts for anything from interpersonal things to getting jobs to all of these different examples. So I think, yeah, beyond just professional titles, thinking about the other sort of ways that these gendered expectations come into play are really important.
And how do you feel as you're discovering this? Because on the one hand, I could paint a picture where we'd say this is really depressing, right? Because we sort of, this is so, and the more one looks at this, the more it's sort of, I don't know, it's just shocking. And I think to sort of, Caroline Criado Perez's work, I think of, anytime I read any research, the headline, "It's worse than you think it is," always comes to mind. So there's a very sort of depressing piece. On the other hand, there's a real sense of optimism and positivity in the way that you talk about it, and the fact that we're discovering these things, we can do something about it, we should do something about it, and there's a real sense of optimism. That's clear in the way that you talk about it. And I wondered, I mean, are you, is my sort of portrayal of darkness and light, is that how you view this? Because I would have thought on the one hand it's really exciting to discover what you've got. On the other hand, man, it's depressing that we are where we are.
Yeah, I would say cautious optimism. is how I think about it. If we continue to not make any changes, I think we're going to have these problems for a really long time. But I think there are so many examples in society and also on the parts of individual organizations that have been saying this is something that's important to us. We actively want to adopt strategies that are going to help balance the playing field, things like this. And I'll point to some of my colleagues' Tessa Charlesworth work. She's been looking at long term change and explicit biases. So, how positive or negatively we feel towards certain groups, and also about stereotypes. And she's been looking in particular about gendered stereotypes, about science versus arts. And we typically find that men are more associated with science and women are more associated with arts. And she's also looked at this association between gender and career. So the idea that men are more associated with careers and women are more associated with, staying at home and being a more domestic individual. And what we're seeing is that over spans of 15 years, we're seeing not only really strong reductions in these stereotypes, but also that almost every group is changing. So it's not just that we're going to need to have in a generation, all of the young people need to, all of a sudden be representative of our attitudes, but we're seeing that older people are changing, conservative people are changing, liberal people are changing, people across educations are changing. So it does seem to be something in the air. And we're seeing as a society, we're changing towards neutrality on these really deeply rooted gender stereotypes. So again, if we don't do anything, we can't expect this to continue changing. But I think we can see all across society examples of both in science, people really trying to understand how we can make intervention successful. And then also on the parts of individuals and businesses, really trying to adopt research, really trying to do their best to make sure that we don't have these systemic biases. So cautious optimism, I think, is how I would try and describe my current worldview about the state of
Love
science.
it, love it, love it. And I'm fascinated by the reaction to the research, both in terms of publication. But I wanted to start by asking the people the participants. How did they feel about it? And I guess what was the construct they were given as they were going in? Because presumably you didn't just ask one question. You established and sort of I always like to think about it sort of it's a bit like you go and see a show and there's a warm-up act, right? You've got to get what was the construct that you created and then how did they react when they realized what was happening?
Yeah. So we obviously participants go through the consent process. They learn a little bit about it. I think we said something like, we want to understand how you reason about social groups or something super, super broad, right? And
Right, so
then
not misleading, but not revealing.
exactly, yeah. No deception here. That's for my IRB. Um, but we start by just asking demographic questions, and most people who are on these platforms, are pretty used to these. So we're not asking men on the streets sorts of questions. We're asking people who are pretty seasoned with these sorts of experiments, and then we just say, okay, next we're going to ask you a riddle, and then we showed the riddle, and again we manipulated whether we called it a riddle or not. In some, we told them it was a story, or we said we're going to have you listen to read a vignette and then provide a solution. Um, and so for those sorts of things, we didn't get people's immediate reactions in terms of their facial expressions and stuff, but we have given this riddle to enough people to know that people are genuinely confused by this riddle. And it's only once we reveal the other solution that you start seeing people banging their heads or getting really embarrassed, or you see people being like, "Oh, I'm really sorry," or I can't believe I did that. So I would say that we don't do a ton of leading up to it or trying to get them like comfortable with the idea because we're really interested in just their spontaneous reaction to this riddle. If we were, for example, to talk about like something that might, prime the representation of women in surgery or women in medicine, that might be again something that's more of an intervention. But we really wanted to first establish the effect before trying to interpret before trying to have any intervention. So yeah, wasn't a surprising amount of runway before we just went ahead and asked them this. But I think when people are reading it for the most part, they don't even think it's a weird question. They just think it's something that they're responding to, and it's only once they realize that they were so horribly off that all of a sudden they start being like, "Oh, why'd you ask this to me?"
Well, because I was thinking, and I've sort of been reflecting as I was preparing for this conversation. If I'm being honest, right, which is always a good thing to be, I think so. If I'd gone in and I'd been going through this, I would have known what the right answer was, but that would have been pattern recognition because I've heard the stories before. I think if I'd come at it fresh, I probably would have been stumped. And I certainly and so that I've been sort of trying to square the circle on that one and thinking I wouldn't have got that wrong. But I think the only reason I wouldn't have got it wrong is because I know the story. And so that's not a good illustration of how my subconsciously, that's just pattern recognition of a different kind. And so
Yeah.
I want yeah, which I've sort of been struggling with dealing with, but I do think that's genuinely how I think I would have responded.
Yeah, and we made sure to catch people like you because we know that this riddle has been something that has become super, super popular. It's in classrooms. And just like you're saying, we wanted to make sure that what we're separating is people who are reading the riddle and they're responding on the basis of what, their actual logical reasoning versus people who are remembering this riddle. And so we made sure to ask people questions about whether they had seen the riddle before, whether they remembered the answers, things like that. And you find that for people who say that they've seen the riddle before, almost everyone is like, "Yeah, I remember that the answer was mother." So it's definitely seems to be, something that's a pretty memorable experience because across the board, people are remembering the answer. And in fact, some work has actually used this as a teaching intervention and tried to show that, using things like this to really get people to recognize a bias in a way that's sort of fun and light can be helpful because sometimes when you introduce the topic of implicit bias or any sort of discrimination, you get people who are really defensive and rightfully so because they really believe for the most part in having these egalitarian values, trying to treat people equally. And so if you go ahead and tell them, "Oh no, like you're actually really biased." People are gonna be like, "Oh, no, that's not me. This, we're going to this diversity training for other people, for
Right,
George,
right, right, right.
who's always calling people sweetie. I don't do that. I just hired someone who was X or something like that. And so I think this riddle is really sort of fun in that way because as soon as you learn the answer, you see immediately that you did have a pretty big gap in who you were imagining. But it sort of has this levity to it that allows you to have conversations about it. It makes you want to ask someone else. And I think that's the nice property of it. And we've seen all of these people reaching out to say, "Oh, I asked my class or I asked my daughter or I asked my son." And in most of the cases they're saying, and they also felt for it. Like and it's sort of spurring these conversations. And you also see, "Oh no, I had a 6-year-old son who got it right and thought the whole thing was dumb because of course someone can be a female surgeon." And so I think you sort of see this broad range and you see some of this change already starting to start when you have young children who are able to get it quickly because they're growing up in a society that is just totally different from how we were raised.
Right, and I was just sort of thinking to myself, I get it, if you to change the word slightly, I'd still the pattern recognition would still work. But I was wondering actually, is there if there was a way of doing it where you change the construct slightly so that it wasn't recognizable to my system one brain, I think I would still be caught out by other means, and that for me is really interesting. Something I need to think about. But I love the way you're talking about it as a sort of user friendly vessel. That's a terrible phrase, but you know what I mean. It's a nice. It's not attacking people, and I think this is really interesting because this is a subject where ignoring the people that sort of are proud of the fact that they might display sexist tendencies, actually for the average person doesn't want to be thought of and would hate to find themselves in that position. Any other form of teaching or lessons, as you say, could be, I mean, it could have exactly the opposite reaction, provoke real reactance. And so I love this idea of the sort of the curiosity factor, and it's a simple tale to tell, and it's sort of there's a commonality, everybody understands it. So it's almost a very powerful vehicle for us to think about how can we communicate messages to people around biases rather than the classic, as you pointed out. Congratulate you. You must now go on some unconscious bias training where we are, and the implicit message, they're going to try and reprogram me. I will not let that happen. Reactance. That's a really interesting pointer potentially to how we could think about communicating. And so I guess question one is: are there similar things out there that you've come across, or is this a one-off just because of the history behind it or the construct?
Yeah. So I would say it's not a one-off. I think that the approach of trying to make clear the fact that we're not trying to single people out as bad people, and we're recognizing the effect of culture on these beliefs, on these stereotypes. Um, I'll of course note that it also can be problematic to say that everyone has these biases, right? Because then all of a sudden you're creating this really nice cop out for people to say, "Oh, yeah, well, sure, I'm biased, but so is everyone."
Right.
So whatever. And there has been some work showing that when you overly attribute actions or biased outcomes to implicit rather than explicit bias, you do see that people give people a little bit more leeway. And this makes sense because if you're thinking about someone who is going through this process and actively thinking about it and then making a biased decision versus someone who is making a biased decision because of, you know, these more implicit processes, it makes sense. And so I will put that out there to say that we have to be careful about the way that we try and engage with these conversations. But I actually wrote a piece for Outsmarting Implicit Bias with my advisor, Mazin Fanaji, and Olivia Kang. And what we were looking at is why are all of these implicit bias or diversity trainings failing, right? There are a bunch of meta analyses that looked and actually found that in some cases, after diversity training, the diversity of companies decreased.
Right. It's
And
counterproductive. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of productive. And so I think there's been a lot of people doing really great work trying to understand why this is the case. And a lot of what we've been thinking is exactly what we're talking about. That the way that people have been going about diversity training in the past, it's really boring. It makes people feel bad about themselves. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't make people to some degree feel bad about them. I think anyone who is looking at the data and recognizing that they're part of it, like they should say, I should be changing and I want to be changing. Um, but I think when we start these diversity trainings with optical illusions or just things that show us that what we see is not always what actually exists. So that's the way my advisor likes to start these diversity trainings, that she just shows some optical illusion. And then she shows some things that also are like optical illusion in the social domain. So she'll show, for example, that we see color differently depending on whether the person's face is labeled white or black. So we have morphs of faces, right, that are a morph of a white face and a black face. And the combination, yeah, whether it's labeled white or whether it's labeled black, we actually see a darker face if it's labeled black. So when you sort of start with this more almost introduction to the way that our minds work, it makes it a lot easier for people to say, "Oh, of course I would have developed these biases." So they're still taking ownership for the bias, but they're not seeing it as something that's necessarily they have these biases because they want to or because it reflects what they actually explicitly endorse. And so I think that becomes really helpful for people. And especially then when you try and give them solutions like a structured interview and you show them how, for example, we have this bias toward people who are like us. And so if you sit in an interview and all of a sudden you're looking at their resume and you see, oh, I was also on a crew team. And you spend 5 minutes out of your 30 minutes talking about your experience rowing. Like that has no relevance to this programming job, and yet you're going to leave with a really great experience of this person because you have this commonality. And so trying to pair these very data driven solutions with really interpretable explanations about why things like a structured interview could be helpful, I think those are the sorts of diversity trainings that are really going to be actually effective.
And I love that example of sort of, the interview gets diverted because you have something in common. Well, that's a natural human thing, right? When we're trying to bond with someone in any other context, you're looking for that level of commonality. And so if it's presented to you on a page, it would be weird in a way if you weren't taking advantage of it. That would be strange because every other context that we know, that is exactly what we do. And it's a very smart thing to do because it builds a bond with the person. here is a process that we're put in. So in some respects, you can sort of say, well, the interview process, it's the process that is driving that particular outcome. And what I think is fascinating when you talk about it is you've just highlighted a really engaging way of simultaneously saying to people, it is natural that we do this, but also that doesn't let you off the hook. And that combination, whereas typically speaking, as you say, one end of the spectrum is, well, I'm just a human. I'm just doing what humans do. Excuse. On the other hand, it's like, how dare you criticize who
Yeah.
I am? And so I think there's a really interesting, delicate balancing act. And I love the way you're talking about both the research, but also the solutions around recognizing that. In other words, we are studying human beings here and how human beings interact. And so we have to develop solutions and an understanding of what drives that on a human level.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's totally, like you're saying, normal to try and find commonality. And I think there's this idea of culture fit, right? That I'm going to work really well with people who are like me. And so if this interview is going really well, then that's probably an indicator that we're going to be good teammates. And so I think that, there's obviously a lot that goes into, sorry, there's a noise in the background. I'm going to wait a second. I don't know if you can hear the motorcycle.
Yeah, I can. I was enjoying it. I'm glad you told me what it was, though, because it sounded potentially like there was a wild animal out there.
Oh, no. They're just motorcycles. So where was I?
Talking about the human approach to this, and you do interview someone, and you think you're going to get on well with them because you know them.
Yes. So there's obviously some truth to this idea that if you can get along with someone, you're going to work well together. But I think that really takes away from the fact that if you all of a sudden have these interviews when you're really not getting at people's qualifications, then that's really not going to be actually an effective interview. And on the other hand, also, there's a lot of work that's shown that having diversity in perspectives and ideas and backgrounds can be really, really helpful. And so by trying to select people who look just like you or have really similar experiences, you're maybe hurting your company because you're not allowing for the fact that someone who's coming from a slightly different experience, either in terms of their area or how they go about, solving problems, that actually might be a much bigger ad. And it's also on us to make sure that the culture fit is there, right? As people in organizations, we can change culture fit by just making sure that people feel more comfortable in these spaces. So I think, yes, it's totally natural to want to have these commonalities between the people, but it's also great for us to learn how to be able to make these connections with people that we don't typically interact with. And that's really, really important as our world starts becoming more diverse. And as we really want to try and make our organizations reflective of that wonderful diversity that does exist.
And we've talked about the reaction of the people going through the research process. What's the reaction to the research been post publication? Because obviously you got my attention. Has everybody reacted the same way? Has there been challenge to it? Surprise? What's people's reaction been?
Yeah, so I would say that there have been a lot of people who have been surprised because, like you, they've heard the riddle many, many years ago and are just absolutely shocked that it's still this bad. There have also been people who similarly have heard this riddle for a really long time and have been using it in their classroom for decades, and they're saying year after year it works. With some exceptions of people saying, "Oh yeah, more people nowadays know the riddle." But again, same sort of thing. You ask people if you've heard this riddle before, put your hands down, sort of situation. I think that there have also been some people who have said, "Well, is this really a stereotype? Of course, if there was a surgeon that walked in the room, I would recognize that they're a surgeon, even if they're female." And what I would say to people who are saying things like that is, okay, I know lots of people where that's happened, and the surgeon has literally walked into the room. And rather than saying, "Oh, that's my surgeon," you say things like I mentioned earlier, "Oh, where is the surgeon?" Or you assume that it's the nurse. And, I was sort of having fun, and I don't mean the word fun in the sense that it was enjoyable for me, but it was interesting, I guess is just a better way of saying it, of looking even on Twitter and just seeing how many examples I could find immediately of people having these experiences, of a woman walking around at a surgical conference and someone asking, "Oh, are you a surgeon?" In what other situation, if you have a conference of, ice cream scientists or something, and everyone is in that room for the same person, are you going to go, are you
There's a
going to
clue in the context, right?
yeah, like the context is so clear. And I think those are the sort of situations that really show that the boundary conditions of this effect are quite large, right? Even someone who is a surgeon, right? This man presumably was a surgeon. And so you would hope that at his hospital or wherever he's performing surgery, he would be in contact with female surgeon. So that was the sort of person you would hope where they've had enough exposure to female surgeons. And yet there they are at a surgical conference asking whether someone actually performs surgery. And I loved her response. She said, yes, that's what surgeons do. Yeah, I think, yeah. And so to go back to your original thing of like, why are women tacking on the word, the letters doctor to their signature or, bringing it up more? And I think it's because we have so many situations where this is happening. Even just with, my own advisor, I remember a story of her being in her office and it says, Dr. Benaji outside of the office. She's sitting in the office at the computer. Someone walks in looking for Dr. Benaji and can't find them. And
Right,
it
because this is the person who's cleaning. I know this is the IT person. I don't know. It's weird, isn't it?
yes, this person doing data analysis on this computer. What an imposter.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and so anyone who says, "Oh, I don't think this is due to stereotyping," or tries to find some convoluted answer about why this is happening, I would say, I hope you're right. I hope that you can explain why all of this is happening and attribute it to some other reason than these really strong mental connections. But all of the work that I've been seeing suggests that no, the reason that young children, when they draw a scientist, they draw a male scientist, the reason that we have all of these findings is, because we do have these mental associations that are really bounding our minds in terms of what we can think.
But the bit I find interesting though is it's a very strange thing to defend, right? Because so even if I thought it wasn't as prevalent as you're suggesting, and I
Mhm.
don't for the record, but even if I did, so what harm is there in saying this is still a problem? So even if you think it's not a very big problem, why wouldn't we try and eliminate it and look at it? So I find it a very strange thing to defend because I'd be saying, look, even if it's only happening, let's make up a number, 10% of the time, that's 10% times that's unnecessary and that we should try and get rid of that in the same way that we don't want, racism is not a good thing, right? So no matter how big the problem, if it exists, we should try and eliminate it. And so I think that's a really interesting thing that people try and defend it, because I would sit there and say, even if I disagree with you, it's not going to do me any harm for you to continue with your research and try and eliminate this thing, because, well, hell, if you're even right by 1%, we should try and do something.
Yeah, so I think you should be my spokesperson. And whenever I come and talk about this research, you can go ahead and do the preamble, and then hopefully they'll all be too scared to to ask anything else.
Right, because that would send the right signal. Let's have a man in here
You're right. Here I am. Here I am.
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I've now brought a woman to explain women's things, and now make sure you listen to what she has to say. So, I mean, it's fascinating, and I think all of this points to the same dynamic, right? Which is
Mhm.
that it's more ingrained than we might like to think,
Yeah.
and therefore the game is on, right? We have to do something, but it's delightful to hear. So that's fascinating, because I thought you were going to say that the vast majority of people, were shocked but supportive, but it sounds like there is still that interesting bit, which I guess shows the scale of the challenge that we've got. But look, I'm delighted that you're doing this. Where does your research take you next? Because you've opened, in what you've just talked about, you've opened a ton of doors, any one of which would be valid to go through. Which ones are you going to pick?
Yeah. So I have been, trying to, when I'm explaining my research, I have, I think, 10 active projects or something like that. And as I'm sort of looking at the scope of what I'm doing, I'm noticing that the common thread seems to be that I'm really interested in these stereotypes that don't really seem to make sense. So, for this example, like it doesn't really seem to make sense that when people have all the time in the world and they can make rational inferences, they don't. And so, similarly, I'm really interested in how the American foreign stereotypes I mentioned earlier, with this tendency to ascribe this concept of American more to white, how has that changed over the past 15 years? How has that changed during COVID? Um, and also other things like the fact that we attribute the concept of human to certain groups more than others. So again, there's factual error that's happening. And so trying to understand where these stereotypes exist, how to change them, on both these more behavioral measures and also, like I mentioned earlier, trying to now track these stereotypes in language, which gives us the ability to go all the way back hundreds of years where we didn't have the the pleasure of being able to ask people questions and get their responses and be able to start tracking more as society has changed over the periods of hundreds of years. How can we see things changing and what does that look like for the future?
Wow, and just talk me through that COVID piece. Is that just because it's a sort of a time that has had a huge impact in many different ways, and therefore you just want to test what it's done, or are there specific COVID dynamics that have exacerbated this issue?
Yeah. So we have data from 2007 all the way up to December of 2021. And we're looking at long term change of these Asian, white, American, foreign stereotypes. And so we're interested in, we've been seeing all of this work showing the xenophobia that's happened throughout COVID. And so we wanted to see to what extent this stereotype was basically impacted by this really large societal upheaval. And as we know, the pandemic hasn't impacted everyone equally. It's especially put a burden on people of color, frontline workers, lower income, and that's also what we're seeing in the data. So for white individuals, for example, we're seeing pretty stable long-term trends even throughout COVID. But for Asian individuals, we're seeing that COVID actually started reversing their trend. So they were about a neutrality, more equally associating American, foreign with white and Asian equally. So they were showing no bias. And then after COVID, they started seeing a bias in the direction of this American equals white. And so what this is showing is that maybe for some reason, they are not for some reason, they're experiencing much more of this xenophobia and anti-Asian sentiment that's actually being reflected in the stereotypes they're holding from their about their own groups. So that's just one example, and we're also looking at geographic variation. So our areas that were COVID hotspots, for example, do we see stereotypes changing more? And I would say like the general trend is that these stereotypes are actually pretty robust to even these large scale societal upheavals, which is sort of nice in some ways because it shows that once you have a stereotype just changing so fast. So we've seen a 47% reduction in stereotypes over the past 15 years. Is that, like I said, there's this in the air. And even if we have some people who are, committing really horrible acts of violence against Asian individuals, you're seeing as a society, we are really expressing more support for these groups than anything else.
Wow, I love it. There is this pervasive sense of positivity when you talk about it, which I guess is what drives your research. But it really comes through. It's really engaging, and I have to say, I'm delighted that you're there doing what you do because I think it requires it's super important work, but it requires having passion behind it. I think is just incredibly meaningful, and I think is implicit in why you're thinking. This isn't just a sort of intellectually interesting piece of research to you. I'm really sensing there's a commitment and a conviction here that just comes across in the way you talk about it, and I think that is one really inspiring. So thank you for that, and I know listeners will have got that sense as well. But secondly, I think gives you a really interesting perspective on it. You're not just this isn't just sort of natural curiosity. You really want to change stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people who are starting these topics are feeling because if I looked at these data and I just said, "Oh, this can't change. This is going to be what it's like forever," then that would be really deflating and also really counterproductive. Because there is and a lot of it is really new data too. So for decades, especially with implicit cognition, people thought of implicit associations as these cognitive monsters that could never change. Because, like I was mentioning earlier, it was thought to be based on these co-occurrences or the patterns we're seeing in the world. And the idea was that once they're formed, they're sort of solidified. And what we now know is that we're seeing all of this change across society. And we've also been seeing work with small term interventions showing that there's malleability. And so I think if everyone in this field sort of accepted the fact that we could never change, then we would be seeing these experiments because people would never say, "Oh, I wonder if we could introduce gender neutral language. Would that change anything?" People would say, "Of course not. There's no way that a small linguistic shift would actually change people's ability to think about a female surgeon."
I mean,
And
it sounds absurd, right? Like,
yeah,
why would that make a difference?
it does. But if you think about the fact that we're so inundated with male gendered language and using words like he to mean he and she or a person of any gender, if you think about how that using that constantly is changing, just what we're seeing immediately, And if you strip that away and now allow for the possibility that this person is just a person, it's just a person in a role, and you can imagine any sort of person in that role, then it's sort of freeing. And I think that all of this work is really it's inspiring to see people from so many different domains and so many different fields studying the problem in such different ways. So looking at the linguistics or studying the difference between gendered language and gender neutral languages. Then also people who are trying to, look at how exposure to counter stereotype exemplars, how that's changing whether or not a woman wants to enter STEM, or how a summer camp where you see female scientists actually gets people more likely to major in a science field. You see all of this data across all of these different fields, and it's hard not to be optimistic because there is change. And as a society, we're changing and we're seeing that there is a desire to change too. It's not just that we're publishing this work and it's not being received. There are plenty of organizations who frankly aren't even looking at the data, but they're just saying, I want to change. I'm going to do things that I think are right. And, we've seen plenty of cases where people who are trying to be very well meaning are not necessarily producing positive change, but even those individuals are taking it upon themselves to try and and enact a policy, or try and act differently in conversations because they know that all of this data exists in general, and that people have these biases. And so I think we're bound to change, and I hope it's in the right direction.
And I love that you're also removing excuses. So not only are you providing the data, but you're also thinking about the potential solutions. And so there will be people that will argue against this and will sort of cling to fossilized dinosaurs who will cling to the sort of old ways of doing things. But what I think is lovely is that it's kind of like it's now staring us in the face. And so, having read your research, and I think of myself as reasonably progressive, although as we've identified, I still have some way to go. But I think I'm out of excuses now, right? Because I've listened to what you said, and it's like, oh, okay, right. The willful blindness isn't really an option anymore once you're presented with these things. And what I love about it is not only doing that, but it's also, well, here's an easy route out, right? So it's not even like you're going to have to come to terms with this really awkward reality, and there's no way out. Sort of almost like, well, your only way is you need to diet massively and change your lifestyle completely. That sort of big shift. You're basically saying, well, actually, like, I'll just give you some facts and some things that are happening, and then here's a nice little. I mean, it's the sort of off ramp, if you
Mhm.
off ramp, yeah, right, not the on ramp, the off ramp, right? And I think that's really interesting as well, because very often we can find reasons why we shouldn't change, and sort of legacy excuses. And so you're providing that and the way out as well.
Yeah, that's the hope. And I would say, to use your words, the fossilized dinosaurs that are out there, we also have evidence, like I said, from Tessa Charlesworth's work, that even those fossilized dinosaurs are changing. And so because the world around us is changing, and all of a sudden, to take the example of Asian Americans, we're seeing a lot more representation on TV shows. We're seeing, like, Netflix has done a really great job recently of trying to make diversity on screen. And when we're seeing people in all different types of roles, we're, not seeing someone as a token, we're seeing them as the love interest, or as the hero. All of a sudden you start thinking, yeah, of course. Like, I don't know why there ever was one sort of person that always had this role. And so I think even people who might look at the data and say, that's fine, but it's not my problem, or it doesn't
Right.
affect me. Sure, those people are going to exist, but I would say to them, I bet in a couple of years, or in 10 years, without even realizing it, because the world around you is changing, so will you. And I think that is something where, so long as we as a society, we really try and have positive change, we're going to pull these people along with us. And again, we're not saying that everyone is changing in terms of all different stereotypes. So there's definitely some work to be done for things like weight and disability and age. Those are attitudes that are really stable. And so we aren't saying that without any change or without any dedication to change, that attitudes are naturally changing. But we are seeing change on some. And so that tells us that if we really put our money where our mouth is and we try and change these attitudes, then we can.
I love it. Do you know what I was thinking as you were talking? That's a beautiful twist on the cruelest experiment, if it ever was an experiment, of the boiling frog. And it's exactly that thing, right? Which is, it's happening subtly,
Yeah.
and so the water is getting warmer, and these, and they're not noticing it. it's kind of just happening, or they may be noticing it, but they're not jumping out of the water. And so there's a lovely twist on the experiment that I hope never ever happened, and is just a nice metaphor for Jay. But I think that's kind of the point you're making, right? Is that it's going on, and therefore that'll shift. So we've now got a beautiful way to think about the boiling frog in a more positive sense, as opposed to the negative one that's normally framed. Kirsten, listen, firstly, thank you for what you're doing, because I genuinely, you're clearly doing it with a real passion, and I think it's really important. And you've given me pause for thought, and thank you for making what could have been very dry research into something incredibly engaging. I mean, the basic premise of it, right, is you're thinking behaviorally about how can you've set up a construct here that is very engaging for people that aren't necessarily research fanatics, but actually it's really, and then the findings are fascinating, and the way you talk about it is super engaging. So thank you, one, for what you do, but secondly, thank you for coming on the podcast and being an amazing guest. I will put links to research, anything else you want me to share with the audience, in the show notes so they can find that. So all that remains to me to do is say thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Kirsten for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Kirsten and her research, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To pre-order my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, which is due out in March, have a look in the show notes. There's links to that there. If you pre-order before the release date, you'll get access to exclusive content and events. Just make sure you keep your receipt from whichever bookstore you buy it from. If you've missed previous episodes of the show, do have a look at the website humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back with more episodes of this show in 2023. But in the meantime, let me wish you all a very happy new year and say thank you so much for listening.